Welcome back to 360 Sports Network. I'm Greg, the mad scientist for sure. And with me tonight is Alex DeLaverson and the venerable James Dodson. Gentlemen, how are you out there tonight?
Going well over here, ready to keep on providing you with some value for your fantasy football drafts.
All's good over here, just ready to talk some wideouts for fantasy football, and it's one of those great times of the year, so I'm just anxious to get this thing going.
There you go. There you go. Well, from the category, it is what it is, but it's not what it should be. Let's talk about these wideouts. There's a lot of them out there. A lot of good ones, a lot of okay ones, but very few great ones. Gentlemen, James, let's talk a little bit about who you have as your top tier number one, elite wide receivers.
Well, he is so tier number one, I'd almost call him tier zero. He's in a league of his own. Calvin Johnson is far and away the top of the wide receiver class this year. 96 catches for over 1,600 yards last year, but 16 touchdowns through the air last year. That's an unbelievable number, by far more than anybody else in the league. In fact, twice as many as some of the other big-name receivers such as Larry Fitzgerald or Roddy White, or even Wes Welker, who had 9 touchdowns of his own. So he is far and away, especially in touchdown-heavy leagues, the top wide receiver. There is nobody else you should consider taking above him, and really there's nobody else that you should even consider taking in the first round besides Megatron himself, Calvin Johnson.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you. I always felt, though, if Larry Fitzgerald had a great quarterback, I think you could make a case for him being number one, but unfortunately, he's stuck with, who is it, Skeleton or whoever it is back there. But yeah, Calvin Johnson, there's no way he's not number one. The guy's just a freak of nature. Matt Stafford's actually one of the better quarterbacks coming along. He had a great fantasy year last year. He should be even better this year. I don't see any reason why that would not be the case. I think a lot of people should also keep an eye on Greg Jennings. I know he's around, number 5, but just the fact that he has Aaron Rodgers throwing him passes, that's definitely always a good thing. Roddy White I'm not as high on for some reason. Maybe it's because I'm not that big of a Matt Ryan fan. I'm not big on the dink and dunk passing, but if Andre Johnson, bearing any more hamstring injuries, which hopefully he won't have a year like he did last year, he could be up there at number 2 also. So I think if Andre Johnson doesn't have any lingering hammy issues, I think I actually might put him in number 2. And as far as Mike Wallace goes, I think most fantasy drafts have him going as the 6th wideout taken. I wouldn't even put him at that, even if the holdout gets settled with the Steelers. He just seems like a disgruntled wide receiver. He's not happy where he's at. And all of a sudden, there's trade talks about him. So we'll see what happens with him. But if your draft is coming up soon, don't touch him.
Yeah, I have to agree with you somewhat there, Alex. I think our disputed number one, though, from the three of us is Megatron himself, Calvin Johnson. Last year, Megatron posted, I believe, 1,681 yards and 16 touchdowns. That in itself just puts himself in the stratosphere. Very verified there indeed. My number 2, I would like to say Larry Fitzgerald, but I would have to say he's probably number 3 on the list only because he doesn't have a quarterback. If he had a great quarterback, he'd probably be where Calvin Johnson is. But by his sheer talent, he's in the top 3, no doubt about it. But I would have to look at Greg Jennings. If Greg Jennings had not had the knee injury at the end of the season, we would have seen a third 1,000-yard season. He ended up with 949 yards receiving and 9 touchdowns. But with Aaron Rodgers out there, the guy's just golden. And, when you look at the number 1 quarterback on the depth charts throughout the entire fantasy football draft, you have to look at Greg Jennings as your number 1 or number 2 receiver out there as well. So my 1, 2, and 3 would be Calvin Johnson, Greg Jennings, and Larry Fitzgerald.
I think even without the quarterback, well, he doesn't have a quarterback out there. I still think you have to have Fitzgerald as your number 2. He had no no quarterback throwing to him last year. He still put up 1,400 yards and still caught 8 touchdown passes. I mean, he's still one of the highest targeted players in the league. He had 5 less targets than Calvin Johnson all of last year. So even without a quarterback, he's still unbelievable. I think you got to have him number 2. Another guy, though, that we haven't mentioned yet, and I'm kind of surprised, maybe it's because you're thinking of a standard league and I always think of a PPR league, but you got to mention Wes Welker. 122 catches last year, 1,500 yards. I don't think he can match either one of those numbers this year, but he is still Wes Welker. He still is going to dominate that underneath game with Tom Brady. I think he can be as high as number 3 or 4 in a PPR league, no doubt.
But James, you said it right. You hit the nail right on the head. I don't think he's going to be able to do that this year, and that's what everybody's banking on, is the fact that he's not going to be able to do that. This guy has teeth longer than a saber-toothed tiger. He's so long on the tooth, even the Patriots aren't even thinking about extending his contract, and this is an old team. So, with that said, he's going to have a decent season, but I don't see the big numbers that we saw before. I think Gronkowski is going to take balls away from him.
Well, for the fact that the Patriots won't or didn't want to sign him long term, that to me that doesn't mean much because the Patriots usually they don't pay that well, and they usually have no problem shipping out their veterans. They do it, I think, more than any other team in the league. But I think one of the biggest factors is just for Wes Welker himself, he's not happy. I mean, he had that drop in the Super Bowl to all those Twitter wars with Willie McGinnis, and he feels like he should be paid more, and he feels like he should be a bigger part of the organization. So, I mean, maybe the whole, I don't want to say disgruntled, but maybe he just doesn't feel like himself there this year. Who knows? I don't know. He's still Wes Welker. He still will have a great year. He'll still be a great addition for PPR leagues, even though I'm not big on PPR leagues. But until then, I don't think age and the fact that the Patriots won't re-sign him should be a big part, because Wes Welker, he's just a system guy. He's just a great system guy, and Brady likes him, so he won't do what he did last year, but he'll be a decent pickup, I think.
Even if he doesn't do what he does last year, I'm not expecting that. Even if he gets 20 less carries and 400 less yards, like I'm expecting, about 100 catches, a little under 1,200 yards, he still comes up as a top 4 or top 5 wideout in every single category, and he has the upside because he can pick it up to well over 110, 120 catches without much difficulty. So, I mean, I'm not expecting the big year like last year, just like I'm saying the same thing for Rob Gronkowski. He doesn't need to get me 18 touchdowns. If he gets me 12, I'll be happy. Wes Welker doesn't need to get 130 catches. If he hits 100, which he consistently does, I'll be happy.
Well, a person that I look at in the upper top 2, or not top 2, but the upper second tier, because I think the first tier is pretty much depleted now, is Victor Cruz. I would have him as probably number 4, number 5 on my list as eligible receivers, only because of his play throughout the entire year, and he actually became Eli Manning's go-to guy. And I think we're going to see the same magic happen again this year that we saw last year. This guy has nowhere to go but up even higher than where he was at before. He had 1,536 yards receiving last year, 82 receptions, 9 touchdowns. The guy was just magic out there.
Another guy that you should look at in the top of Tier 2 is somebody that you probably won't think of right off the bat, and you got to worry about the sophomore slump, but I really like what A.J. Green did as a rookie last year, and with the entire organization being so young and just they are all maturing and growing together. A.J. Green with 65 catches, 1,057 yards, and 7 touchdowns last year. I see all 3 of those numbers going up. I see him easily topping around 80 catches, around 1,200 yards, and probably 8 to 9 touchdowns. He is a guy who has a lot of upside. He can end up being, by the end of the year, Tier 1 quality.
Well, I think both of you know who my Tier 2 top guy is going to be. I said it a lot on our other podcasts we did at the car show and at the Crane Room, but I still think Brandon Lloyd is going to have a great year. I feel like from everything I'm reading, they're trying to make him into the deep threat they've been missing the last few years. Now, obviously, it's not going to be 2007, the Randy Moss, but just imagine Brady to Lloyd and Brady to Gronkowski and Wes Walker. That offense is going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to be almost invincible. So I think as long as Brandon Lloyd doesn't become just another target for Brady, just like another receiver, like kind of like how Ocho Cinco did last year. I think everyone thought Ocho Cinco was better than what his stats were last year, but he wasn't picking up the playbook. I think if Brandon Lloyd just meshes correctly, and all the insider stuff I'm reading from Patriot blogs and ESPN, they're trying to make him their deep threat, and he's just 2 years removed from that great campaign where he led the league in receptions and touchdowns. I think he could have a very, very great year. So we'll see what happens there.
And you mentioned it, though, Alex. We said the same thing with Ocho last year, and it didn't go well. There's so many targets out there. You are a little bit worried about a newcomer coming in and grasping the offense and becoming a Randy Moss-type character in that first year. It makes it a very big risk, so I wouldn't put him quite at Tier 2, but he has a lot of upside. You're definitely right there.
I think a person who we haven't mentioned, though, in the top end of Tier 2 is Jordy Nelson. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't mentioned Jordy Nelson is he's been eclipsed by Greg Jennings, who is in that Tier 1 category. But Jordy Nelson last year hauled in 68 receptions for 1,263 yards. And expect to see even more out of Jordy Nelson this year as well. McCarthy has been quoted earlier this year stating that he wants to give him even more matchups. So he may be the main receiver out there with Greg Jennings, perhaps at the number 2 spot. They may be 1 and 1A, but the way Aaron Rodgers spreads that ball around and the way Jordy Nelson played last year, you can't ignore Jordy Nelson as maybe like a 5 or a 6 on the top 10 receiving core.
Oh, absolutely. 15 touchdown catches last year speaks for itself. But again, you can't expect those numbers for this year. Another guy, though, going to a new home, I'm not a fan of him, but you can't argue how consistent he is, Brandon Marshall. And just looking at his stats, 1,100 yards in 2009, over 1,000 yards in 2010, 1,200 yards last year. He is a consistent force. The only problem was the touchdowns. They were very low down in Miami, but he had quarterback troubles there. He's back with Cutler. They know each other very well. I see them doing some nice things out there in the Windy City.
I don't know. I mean, they're still the Bears. They're still the power run team, the smash mouth team. I'm not as big on Cutler as a lot of other people are. But, yeah, they do have a history, though. So if he was on a team that was more, I don't want to say pass-heavy, but a team that just wasn't so standard and power run like the Bears are, I'd be more confident in him. I'd put him at the Tier 2, but I actually would put him at Tier 3 just for the fact he is on the Bears. But, I mean, we'll see what happens there.
Alex, you're a bit rough there on Brandon Marshall, I think. I actually have him as a solid Tier 2 guy only because the Bears really have no other receivers. And with Cutler out there, he may make Cutler legitimate again. So, with that said, they've got some chemistry, they've got a connection. He's really the only receiver on that team that's even worth mentioning. So that's why I put him as a solid number 2 receiver, or a number 2 tier type guy, I should say.
Well, gentlemen, we just pretty much said right there how diverse of a wide receiver class this is, how deep of a class it is, that Greg can almost put up into a Tier 1.5. I have him solid Tier 2. Alex doesn't want him until Tier 3 because there are so many other guys around. There is such a depth in this class. You can look at any player with such a wide variety of viewing and be able to put him in any category and essentially
I want your honest opinion. Demaryius Thomas.
Demaryius Thomas, yes. He is someone who is a high-reward player. Last year, he only played 11 games, 30 catches, 550 yards. But the one big catch that everybody's going to remember is the 80-yard one against the Steelers in the playoffs last year. And now he has a real quarterback in Peyton Manning out there. I think he is a high-reward guy. Still, though, we don't have enough proof of what he can do as a wide receiver, especially in a pass-heavy offense. So I cannot put him into tier 2. I would put him probably bottom of like a tier 2.5 into top of tier 3, just because I don't have anything to go off of yet from him.
Well, yeah, I mean, having Manning throw to him doesn't hurt, but here's a name that I want to get both your opinions on, and just because apparently he's now a hometown guy for the long run, Antonio Brown. How do you guys feel about him getting that contract extension, and what does this mean for him for fantasy owners and for the Steelers offense?
Well, I think Antonio Brown is going to eclipse Mike Wallace as being the #1 receiver for the Steelers this year. I really do. This guy is a true possession style receiver, much like the way Hines Ward was. What can Brown do for you? Brown can basically, give you your consistent, 12 to 14 yards per catch. He's got explosive ability. He is as fast as Mike Wallace, perhaps even a bit faster, but what's better than Mike Wallace is the fact that he's got more sure hands. Mike Wallace, toward the end of the season last year, had a case of the drops. With that said, I think we're going to expect quite a bit out of AB. Still, though, solid tier 2 guy, maybe 2.5, only because it's the Steelers. And Roethlisberger, he's going to be throwing the ball more, but Roethlisberger is not an Aaron Rodgers. He's not a Drew Brees. And as a result, with the new run and pass offense that Todd Haley's putting in, I'm expecting probably more of a run and less of an emphasis on the passing game. So it's going to be balanced, but we're not going to see huge numbers, but we're going to see what I would call possession receiving numbers.
Well, you say he's going to surpass Mike Wallace. I think he might already have. He had 10 more targets in an equal number of games than Mike Wallace did last year. He's who Roethlisberger looks to most already. So you're right, 2.5 to tier 3, just because Mike Wallace is the guy who gets the touchdowns versus someone like Antonio Brown, who only had two receiving touchdowns last year. Also, if he's still returning punts or kicks, you can get points that way if your league works that way as well.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with you, Dotson. I mean, Wallace, as great as he is, all he really has is speed. I mean, he's not a possession guy or anything like that. He doesn't have much strength, so I feel I have to go with Dotson. I think even this year, just because of the whole holdout, I think now the Steelers are trying to show Antonio Brown that he's the guy. So I do have to agree with Dotson. I think Brown's the guy.
And let me ask you this now. I mean, we just mentioned two very highly rated Steelers receivers who are working together. We've mentioned Brandon Lloyd and Wes Welker, both in New England. What do you think of the two Cowboys receivers, Miles Austin and Dez Bryant, as a 1 and a 1A, who knows which direction? Where would you put them in your rankings?
I would put Miles Austin, I think, at a mid-tier 2 range, only because of the inconsistency, the Cowboys' offense. If the Cowboys' offense comes out gangbusters, Miles Austin could actually be a tier 1 receiver. Dez Bryant would be more of a 1A type guy. And actually, this is a tandem that could be very much like a Greg Jennings and a Jordy Nelson. But it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to agree with you there. Romo, he seems to be a pretty decent fantasy quarterback, even though he can't really get it done in the playoffs. So I think both of them, I think Bryant's going to have just as great a year as Miles Austin. So I think if put him maybe, 17 and 18, put him right back to back, I think, in terms of fantasy rankings. So, because it just seems like not one really sticks out, But we'll see what happens. You got a good fantasy quarterback in Romo, so both are solid pickups.
Here's another pair, though, down there, I would say around a tier 2.5 to tier 3. We haven't mentioned either of their names yet. Deshaun Jackson, Jeremy Maclin. Where do you put those two? Who's above the other? I mean, Deshaun Jackson, you would think I mean, he's such a big name and always gets the big plays. You would think he could be, you know, a top 10 receiver, but I'm seeing him down as low as number 25 in being drafted in some of these mock drafts.
Well, I mean, maybe it's because a lot of these experts are losing faith in Michael Vick as just a pure passer. I'm sorry, but man, it seems like Vick's been around forever. And I know, obviously, he had that 2-year hiatus from football, but still, so much for the dream team last year. I think if I had to pick one or the other, I still have to go with Deshaun Jackson. I mean, I still feel like he's more of a dynamic playmaker, and they just gave him that contract, which probably doesn't make Mike Wallace happy. So I think safer bet Deshaun Jackson, but Jeremy Maclin has a lot of upside to him.
Yeah, Deshaun Jackson was disappointing last year, to say the least. He fell short on the 1,000 yards, only having 961 yards. Only had 4 touchdowns. It seemed that Deshaun Jackson was almost becoming a head case there for a little bit. I think Maclin is a little bit more consistent. But you know, once again, I mean, he did only have 859 yards. And I think this is one of the problems with the Eagles. The Eagles really don't have, well, what is their philosophy? Are they a run team or are they a throwing team? You know, with Michael Vick out there, I mean, Michael Vick and LaShawn McCoy, I think, have more yards rushing than the entire receiving corps.
Who knows what it's going to be, because then you say that and you feel that way, but then you see games where LaShawn McCoy has only 8 rushes. So you don't know what to expect out of the Eagles, and that inconsistency, I think, is what needs to keep the Eagles receivers a little bit lower on the draft boards than you would probably expect.
Exactly, and that's why, you know, these guys, I think, are solid Tier 3, maybe Tier 2 3.5 or Tier 3.
Greg, I'm surprised you haven't mentioned Stevie Johnson yet.
Stevie, I blame God Johnson. You know, the guy's a goof, but he's a lovable goof. But, you know, here's the thing. You know, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. You live by Stevie Johnson, you're going to perish. Only because Fitzpatrick had a way of just throwing the INT, you know, so often than not. Where do you put this guy? That's a good question. He's definitely the number 1 receiver up in Buffalo, but if you're relying on Buffalo to get you points, you're probably going to be vying for last place in your fantasy slot. So he's probably a solid Tier 3 guy, maybe a low-end Tier 2. Definitely somebody that if it's in the 10th round and he's there, you definitely draft the guy. And he's got a tremendous upside if we can get the ball to him on a regular basis. And that goes back to Fitzpatrick, basically going back to fundamentals. And we were watching Fitzpatrick and his delivery, and his delivery he was basically tipping off where he was going to be throwing the ball when he dropped back to pass every single time, and defenses were picking that up. So, I mean, if Fitzpatrick can disguise his delivery a little bit and mix things up a little bit, yeah, it's going to help Stevie Johnson in a huge way.
Well, and I look, as soon as you get out of the guys we've mentioned as Tier 1, there is nobody who comes close to the number of targets that Stevie Johnson has had in the past 2 years. And only 7 players have had more touchdowns than Stevie has in the last 2 years. So he does have that upside, he does have that potential, but like you've said, and like we've said a lot with some of these players, who's throwing him the ball? Who's going to get the ball to him? Because that makes a big play in the wide receivers. And another guy we haven't mentioned yet, Alex, I know you think a lot of him, is Vincent Jackson, but can someone like Josh Freeman get him the ball enough times to make him be a threat down in Tampa?
Well, I was kind of disappointed in Josh Freeman last year. I thought he was going to have a really great year, but the Buccaneers have struggled as a whole, so maybe they'll get it together this year. I don't know. But one receiver I think, or I don't want to say we're overlooking, but we just not paying much attention to him, is Steve Smith from Carolina. Remember him? And how about Cam Newton coming along? What a beast he's been.
It's funny you should mention Steve Smith because Sports Illustrated has him listed as a Tier 1 number 3 receiver. Imagine that.
I think that's way too high, Greg.
That's what Sports Illustrated is doing.
Well, no, ESPN has him ranked that high too. Well, they have him ranked at the 14th best wide receiver. I think it's just due to the fact that Cam Newton had such a great year last year, and regarding he doesn't have a sophomore slump, he could do great things this year. So, but he's kind of older too. But,
yeah, he's 33 years old. He came out of nowhere last year with Cam Newton being there, but I don't see any way that he can improve upon his numbers because he is a step slower. He was a speed receiver, and he's only 5'9". He's not going to leap up and catch touchdown passes. I don't see his numbers able to go up at all, no matter how good Cam Newton does, just because Steve Smith is getting older and he doesn't have the height to compensate for it.
I happen to agree with you on that, James, only because of the fact he's been around, I think, longer than Wes Welker. Yeah, he has been. Wes Welker's only 31. This guy's 33. Granted, he took advantage of a fantastic situation, but we're looking at a guy who's basically a half step slower. He's in the twilight of his career right now. I don't see big things happening right now with Steve Smith. I think, to put him that high, it would be a bust. The guy's a solid Tier 2 guy, no doubt about it. But he's not a Tier 1 guy at all.
Is there anybody else that we're missing here that we would put in this, this top cluster of Tier 1, 2, 3, which probably goes through about number 26 or 27 in the overall wide receivers? Is there anybody else that we've missed that we need to cover?
I think we have to take a look at Marquise Colston.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Marquise Colston, and also we have to take a very hard look at Julio Jones and Kenny Britt. So, gentlemen, let's talk about those three.
Well, starting with Colston, he's a tough prospect to look at because Drew Brees spreads the ball around so well, and it's quite scary actually how well he spreads it out. Colston is the only consistent receiver in terms of getting those numbers.
Besides his tight end, of course, now.
Well, besides his tight end and besides his running back. But in terms of a receiver, there is nobody more consistent out there. Lance Moore can get touchdowns randomly, but then he'll go and not catch a pass. And Robert Meacham now no longer there. I don't know. It makes it very difficult. I think Colston, I think you got to put him Tier 2. I think it's tough to say, though, because he does have a Jimmy Graham.
Kenny Britt, a couple years ago, in 2010, he was having a great year. I think one of his first few starts, he had like 40 points receiving, and until he got hurt, and of course, they picked up Randy Moss, and that didn't work out at all. So I think Kenny Britt, as long as he stays out of trouble, can have a great year. I do like Matt Hasselbeck as a quarterback. I know a lot of people aren't sold on him, but I think he could be a great connection there, like they were in 2000. Not like they were in 2010 because he wasn't there, but I think if they can get some chemistry there, I think Kenny Britt could have a great year.
Or even if it's Jake Locker, and I think it might be Jake Locker, and I think it might work out better for Britt.
I was just about to say, or Jake Locker. I don't know what they're doing down there, so we'll see.
And as for Julio Jones, I mean, you mentioned it. Matt Ryan he might be the Iceman, but his fantasy numbers just aren't consistent enough to get the ball out to Julio Jones. He did not give impressive numbers during that first year, and really it's a bit of a disappointment that they weren't any better. Some people are really highly rating this guy, and I just don't see it. Yeah, he missed 3 games. Even with those 3 games that he missed, he would be averaging, or he would have gotten a little over 1,000 yards. 8 touchdowns are nice for him, but again, it's the inconsistent. He has a great week one week, and then the next week it's 2 catches for 10 yards. So Julio Jones scares me a little bit. That's why I have him bottom of Tier 2.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that with Julio Jones. However, when you take a look at Roddy White and Julio Jones, both of those guys are kind of in stealth mode only because of the fact of Matt Ryan. If Matt Ryan steps up his play and is more consistent, and again, I think the Falcons are a team much like the Eagles. They have to decide what type of team they are. If they're a throwing team, these guys' numbers will be outstanding. But if they decide to try to run the ball and dink and dunk, we're going to see something completely different.
That pretty much wraps up our top tier wideouts that you would see probably going through the first 8 to 10 rounds for sure. Who are some sleeper guys, though, that we ought to keep our eye out for in the later rounds as you're looking to fill up your bench? Someone who could become a big stud starter for you by the end of the year.
Well, I'm really excited about Eric Decker right now over there in Denver with the new system out there that's been employed by Peyton Manning. It's not going to take long for Eric Decker to really start to shine. You know, you have Demarius Thomas, you have Eric Decker. These guys could be the 1-2, much like the Reggie Wayne and oh God, who's the other guy out there in Indianapolis that Peyton threw to all the time?
Marvin Harrison.
Marvin Harrison, thank you. You know, it's like when you're taking a look at with those types of tandems, Peyton Manning's the type of guy that spreads the ball around. It's like Aaron Rodgers spreads the ball around. Eric Decker is going to have a tremendous season in 2012. I mean, being that he had 612 yards receiving last year with Tim Tebow, this is a whole new system, a whole new ball game. I really see big things here for Eric Decker.
Funny you should mention Reggie Wayne, because he's one of the guys that I think we're all forgetting about, and I can't believe it. Who cares if he's going to have someone like Andrew Luck as his quarterback this year?
Well, I would care. I mean, I wouldn't. If you have a rookie quarterback coming in, the question was who could be a starter for you at the end of the year. I mean, do you really think Reggie Wayne could be a starter for you at the end of the year?
I would start him at the beginning of the year. I think that he's the top guy that he's going to be getting the passes thrown his way. I mean, he's going to get your catches for you. Even with the terrible quarterbacks he had last year, he still posted 75 catches and almost 1,000 yards. So I think you definitely need to have Reggie Wayne, and people just are absolutely dropping him off the face of the earth, and I don't see why.
Well, I don't know if I'd make him a starter. I mean, I think he might be a good sleeper pick if you want to use that, but I don't know if I'd make him a starter. But I have a couple questions for you. I'm going to name a couple guys, and you guys are going to tell me what you think of their fantasy potential this year. All right, number one, Chad Ochocinco. Thoughts and guys?
What Greg said.
What Greg said? Okay.
You can't take a risk on Ochocinco unless you get fantasy points every time that he swears on HBO. Then you don't draft him.
No.
Hey, it's funny though. Well,
funny doesn't get me fantasy points. I'm sorry.
Funny doesn't win championships. I'm sorry.
Okay. Randy Moss.
Rick? See, now I disagree, Mr. Mad Scientist. I think Randy Moss is somebody well worth a draft pick later in the rounds. Because he is Randy Moss, no, he's not going to start on my team right away. I need to see what he does. But when I'm hearing that Harbaugh is having him at the number one wide receiver position out there, that's enough for me to pick him up. Again, people are worried because it's Alex Smith as the quarterback that he's not going to get it to him. No, he got it to his weapons enough last year. I think he can do it again. Someone like Randy Moss, I might have to drop him after week 5 if he's not doing anything, but he has way too much reward in him not to draft him in the later rounds of a fantasy football draft. You need to pick up this guy.
That's exactly how I feel too. When he first signed with the Niners, I just thought it was kind of maybe use him as a red zone target, maybe use him as a decoy, all that fun stuff. But from everything I'm reading, just for the fact that already he's at the top of the 49er depth chart, either means he's doing really well or the rest of the Niners receivers really stink. And it's probably a mixture of the two. But
the rest of the 49ers receivers were on milk cartons, Alex.
Well, that's what I said. It's a mixture of the two. But from everything I'm reading, he could still run a 4.3.
You're telling me that Michael Crabtree and Mario Manningham are on milk cartons?
Yeah. Oh, my God. They disappeared at the end of the season.
Well, the Niners really did have bad receivers. That's why I think they've only had, a total of 3 receptions in the championship game last year. The receivers. And I think that might be another reason why Moss is getting such a heavy push in number one. Even though the Niners drafted, Jenkins and brought in Manningham, I just can't get over the fact that Moss is already number one on the depth chart. Mr. Randy Slouch Moss. But
that tells you how bad things are over there in San Francisco. Not necessarily how good Randy Moss is. Remember this. Zebras don't change their stripes. Randy Moss has a horrible, horrible work ethic. The fact that he's still in the NFL is a miracle in itself.
Alex has big news on that work ethic, though.
Look, he wants to play. He wants to win a championship. He wants to be back. This is what I think is going to happen. If the Niners start out well, okay, if they win the first few games and Randy is just getting decent touches, Moss, I think, will explode. If they start out, 2-3, 2-4, Moss is going to shut it down. The early part of the season is going to dictate what Randy Moss does. But honestly, from everything I'm reading and hearing, he just wants to rip someone's head off this year. That's all he says. He said he's not coming out to half step. And I think with the contract he has, he knows it. He has no guaranteed money at all. They come in now, no money.
Let me ask you this. I'm going to float another name past you. You're in the middle rounds. Round 7, round 8. You have Randy Moss and you have Malcolm Floyd. Who do you pick?
I would still pick Moss.
Really?
I would. It's just such a high risk, low reward thing. I don't know how much Malcolm Floyd's going to do as a rookie, But here's the thing: Moss is still 6'4". He's going to be a red zone target, even if he doesn't do anything. They're still going to line him up in the red zone. They'll float a couple up there, just for that alone. Just because he's so tall, all he has to do is put up his arm. He'll get a decent amount of touches in there. I think he'll get like 6 just red zone touches this year.
Well, Greg, did you say Michael Floyd, the rookie at Arizona, or Malcolm Floyd
from San Diego?
Malcolm Floyd. Okay,
Number
Michael
2 man
Floyd
in San Diego.
Okay, Michael Floyd, I definitely say you're right, Alex. You cannot take a rookie with Skelton throwing him the ball. Malcolm Floyd, I'm a little bit more iffy, but again, I look at his numbers. Not only is he averaging only 40 catches the last 2 years, that's also because he's missed 9 games in the past 2 years. Not only is he inconsistent because the Norv Turner offense is inconsistent, but he just isn't on the field enough. I take Randy Moss as a much bigger reward play.
But you're looking now as the number 1 guy over there is Robert Meacham. Vincent Jackson is gone. He's got the connection with Phillip Rivers. This guy can out-jump half the team. He's a major target down there. Malcolm Floyd's a definite sleeper. And that's somebody that I would definitely look very long and hard at before I even invested a nickel in Randy Moss.
You make good points there, and he is a sleeper that I'm also considering at that point. I think that you have a bigger reward possibility with a Randy Moss. In a 7th or 8th round, if you're looking to draft a receiver, Floyd might be your better pick because he might get you the more consistent points, although he does miss a lot of games. Randy Moss, I'm saying if he's still around in 10th, 11th round when you're filling up your bench, he is someone to pick up at that point. But 8th round, if you are looking for a starter, yes, look at Floyd first.
No complaints from me there.
What do you think of Danny Amendola? I mean, he had an injury in the first game last year with the Rams. Yes, he still has Bradford throwing him the ball, but he had one of the top, I think he was a top 10 target guy back in 2010. Can you see him picking up those numbers again with a new quarterback now?
Well, I mean, I had him on my fantasy team a few years ago, and I think he had a few good games for me there, but he never really stuck out much. Bradford, I don't know. I mean, I want to see him do well. I really do. I always thought he was going to do well, and maybe he'll get it together. But Danny Amendola is just not someone I really even think about until you even just said it right there. So I really wouldn't waste a breath with him.
I would have to agree with you there, Alex, as well. I mean, this guy was supplanted by Brian Quick and Chris Givens. These are, draft picks, recent draft picks here. This is a guy that he just doesn't have, I mean, he lacks the ability to turn any catch that he has into a big play. I like the kid. I think he's a nice guy. I just don't think the NFL is the place for him. And definitely not on the fantasy roster.
Well, and I think a big part of that, and a lot with all of these sleepers that we've mentioned so far, it's a worry about who is throwing in the ball, and that makes it difficult. So let me bring in a couple guys we might not be thinking about who do have good quarterbacks. What do you think of James Jones and Randall Cobb in Green Bay? Can either of them fall under the radar but then turn out to be a great play?
Once again, I think with those guys, you have too many people ahead of them. Is it worth a fantasy investment? Unless somebody gets injured, like a Jordy Nelson or Greg Jennings, unless they go down, then you'll start seeing value as they go up the depth chart. But I think they're so far down on the food chain right now, it's not worth even looking at right now in the draft.
Yeah, I mean, I know who they are, but I can't even give you any insight on them because I haven't heard much about them or seen much about them or read much about them. So usually with players like that, I don't try and find a sleeper. You know what I mean? It'll just kind of stick out, and neither of those guys stick out. So that's all I really have to say.
Oh, they're called sleepers for a reason because we're not thinking about them. And I mean, somebody like James Jones, he doesn't stick out much, but you got to look. In his last 3 years, he scored 5 touchdowns in 2009, 5 touchdowns in 2010, and 7 touchdowns last year. He's a consistent touchdown getter. He doesn't have as many yards as everybody else, but I'll tell you what, if you're in a touchdown-heavy league, he is a great guy to pick up that you don't think about because he is the number 3.
All right, well, let me ask you this. What rookie wide receiver is going to have a good year?
Well, I would have said the top rookie wide receiver, I mean, pretty obviously, was going to be Justin Blackmon, but now we have DUI charges. He's probably avoiding jail time. He probably won't even get suspended. You know how that all
probably
works.
Wants to stay in jail. I mean, being drafted by the Jaguars, oh my gosh, that's like the worst franchise he could have went to. I mean, they're probably not even going to be there in a few years. Who knows what's going to happen with them? So
they're rebuilding. Here's someone to keep your eye on. And again, you got to worry about who is throwing in the ball. But a couple late round guys, Brian Quick in St. Louis again is going to be tough. But I'll tell you what. I don't know, the Rams wide receiver coach compared him to Terrell Owens, not because of what he does off the field, but what he does on the field. He's got strong hands, and he has pretty good speed, and he's 6'5". He'll get you some touchdowns. How about a fast guy to think about, though? Devier Posey from Ohio State playing in Houston. If he can hook up as a number 3 receiver in the slot with Matt Schaub down there, I think he could be somebody to take a look at down the stretch. I don't know if I draft either of these guys, but there's somebody as rookies to keep your eye on.
There's a name that we really haven't talked a whole lot about, and that's Pierre Garçon, who is now with the Redskins. And with RG3 commanding the ship over there in Washington, do you see Pierre Garçon's numbers perhaps going up?
Well, they have nowhere to go but up after what he had last year with Indianapolis, but, you know, people are trying to compare what RG3 is going to do based off what Cam Newton did last year. And I think Robert Griffin is a better overall quarterback than Cam Newton. But that doesn't mean that his numbers and his stats are going to show it that way. He's still in a Mike Shanahan offense, and I think that's, as much as anything, might hold back the numbers a little bit more. He's draftable, but I can't say that his numbers are going to skyrocket as a result of having a rookie quarterback in there. Just think about how you're saying that.
Well, I mean, yeah, I agree with you, but I still think Cam Newton is going to be a better quarterback than Robert Griffin III. I just think it's surreal what he did last year as a rookie. I know Big Ben won 15-1 his rookie year, but come on, Cam Newton, man, that guy has so much swagger and 2 400-yard passing games back-to-back. But that's besides the point. We're talking about wide receivers here. How about, I think one name we're really not talking about, and it might be for good reason. This is a guy a couple years ago who had a lot of things going for them, and that was Sidney Rice. And I think probably the biggest issue was just him being on the Seahawks and being with, who's the quarterback down there, Tavares Jackson now?
Well, they've had Tar Jackson. If Matt Flynn goes up there and performs, but we don't know, I mean, we've only seen him start 1 game, so we don't know what to expect from that. It's going to be tough. Sidney Rice being a number 1 wide receiver, yes, he's draftable, but you mentioned it right there. We don't know what to expect when you don't have good chemistry with quarterbacks, especially when the quarterback isn't that great.
After reading the latest edition of Concussion Quarterly, Sidney Rice was on the cover of that magazine. I really do have to worry about his health. And one really, really bad hit is going to put him out probably for his career. When you have 2 concussions in the course of a year last year, it doesn't bode well for one's playing future.
No, you got to look at that. He only played 15 games in the last 2 years combined, so that makes it difficult. We've hit pretty much every major contributing player. Let's talk some general strategy to wrap this up. I think we're all pretty certain Calvin Johnson is your top guy. I personally think he's the only person you should think about drafting in the first round. The other tier 1 guys maybe first to second to third round at best. After that, the receiving class is so deep, I think you wait for a while. What do you guys think in that regard?
Well, I mean, I always draft number 10 in our league. I'm always, 3 years now? I got the last pick, so I think if you get back-to-back picks and you're at the end of your draft, I think you go with the Calvin Johnson, unless there's another good running back available, because I think you should always go with 2 running backs to start out with, if you can get one. And just considering what Matt Stafford and Calvin Johnson did last year, remember at a point in time we were talking about if Calvin Johnson was going to break Randy Moss's 2007 record. Maybe he can do it again this year. Who knows? So I agree with you. If it was anyone else other than Calvin Johnson, I wouldn't draft a wide receiver in the first round. But I think if you get the last pick, I think you either get him with your first rounder or your second rounder.
Right now, I'm really not impressed with the array of wide receivers we have out there. We have 3 really talented people that could make legitimate first-round picks. Larry Fitzgerald, Calvin Johnson, and I would even say Greg Jennings. Greg Jennings might be a bit of a leap. But with that said, you have far more talented running backs and far more talented quarterbacks out there than you have receivers. And if you're looking for points, I'm really, really suggesting that, and if you're short on running backs and you're drafting, let's say, number 10 or number 9 or number 8 in the field, or even number 11 in the field, look at your top 3 tight ends as receivers. If you're looking for a top name player itself who's going to give you some catches, aside from somebody like Wes Welker, Larry Fitzgerald, Greg Jennings, and Calvin Johnson, the receiving talent is pretty much watered down. It's basically famine out there when you're looking at those. Well, that wraps up our wide receiver picks for the evening. I'm Greg the Mad Scientist Bashiro. That was Alex Delavison and James Dodson. And have a good evening.